The original Lost Kingdoms was a game that I had a lot of good memories with from my early days owning a Nintendo GameCube and being a really big fan of JRPGs. Not too many other games really got to share its spotlight for me outside of Phantasy Star Online Episode 1 and 2 and Skies of Arcadia Legends, both Dreamcast ports. I didn't find out about there being a sequel to the card-focused action RPG until the generation was about to come to a close, and having never seen a copy in the wild, I'd only gotten to the point that I could have played it through emulation by the time that my expectations for From Software sequels were already set exceptionally low by Dark Souls 2. One of the main reasons that I wanted to revisit the first game and play it on the channel was so that I could refresh my memory before playing the sequel, a game that I'd been meaning to play for years as I was curious to see where it would stand as a sequel to the original game, but also a second game in a From Software series, especially since it has such strong ties to the Souls series they'd go on to make later. Just as a general warning, I'm going to be comparing this game to its predecessor a lot, so it's best if you either played Lost Kingdoms 1 for yourself or watched my review of it, since a lot of the things have been drastically reworked. If you're good to go, then let's see if this series also faced a grim future with Lost Kingdoms 2. Lost Kingdoms 2 follows a new lead character named Terra Grimface. Terra is an orphan who was left behind and taken in by a group of mercenaries known as the Band of the Scorpion, traveling around and robbing nobles, mostly relying on Terra's runestone to do their deeds. Apparently multiple runestones exist now as they're being manufactured by an empire, and Terra's seems special compared to those. Everything relating to her runestone and her past ends up unfolding over time. Also, yeah, Terra Grimface has got to be an assumed name because it sounds a lot like something out of Warhammer 40k. Oh, okay, yeah. The story in Lost Kingdoms 2 is nothing really special, and kind of just presents itself as a much more generic JRPG story than the previous game did. There's some more production values present, as major scenes are now voice acted, though I can't say if that's actually an improvement.
You have no doubt come here in an attempt to steal our famous runestones, yes?
That's right, Prince Buttercup. We're gonna take your precious little rocks, and you can't do a thing about it.
Oh my, but you sound fierce. Oh, what's this?
The first game didn't exactly have the most intricate or complex story either, but the extra focus on telling it through cutscenes with characters explaining their motives through melodrama is a big step down in that front, especially with this voice acting.
Oh, I'm sorry. After Mother died, they made me queen. I was just a little girl.
That said, I did appreciate that this game's story is an actual continuation of the original, taking place hundreds of years later with Kadia's story being treated as old lore by the setting. I didn't quite hate the story or anything, but the setting and framing of it wasn't too strong compared to the first, which is a shame because that was a massive strength there. Though, the story is not the main draw in Lost Kingdoms 2. The biggest reason to play it is the card-based combat. Instead of random encounters, all enemies are now visible on the map. You no longer get taken away to a different screen to fight anything in a similar way to Okami anymore. Everything just plays out naturally. So enemies are always visible and your cards are always usable. There's a lot of upsides and downsides to this, and I'll begin with the biggest downside so we can get that out of the way first. Interactions with objects are on the A button. So if you move slightly too far out of the way for an interactable object and press a button, which happens from time to time, you use up a card. I think this might be why the first game locked combat behind separate screens, since it had way more interactive objects on the map than this game, and they probably couldn't get the context-sensitive inputs to move smoothly. Since even here it can be a bit finicky. Though in general, this trade-off is pretty good for everything it brings to the table. Obviously, the biggest benefit that having encounters the way Lost Kingdom has them is that the game in general just flows better. Want to skip an enemy? Run past it. Need to regroup? Yeah, you can. Feel like you have to prepare a few decent cards before you face that enemy in the distance? Go nuts with that. There's a lot of small benefits to a system change like this that you normally wouldn't really bring to mind because it all comes so naturally. If you haven't used a card up and discard it because it's not what you want right now, it's safely moved to your draw pile, meaning you're not forced to work with cards that aren't suited for this moment to get to your better cards anymore. This alone feels very liberating. The best change was when I realized that if you summoned a follower minion, you can dismiss it by discarding the card and it still gets put back to your draw pile until he's fully used up. So you don't have the problem with the first game where that follower minion will only have used this one combat and disappears after that. But then you also have blue fairies from the first game again. Since there's no encounter system in this game, they no longer have the chance to summon an enemy encounter upon touching them. Instead, they can only heal you, give you back the MP that you need to use for your cards, or give you back a used up card, which is all really good, keeps you active longer in the stage, and generally just speeds up the momentum of the game. These are all things that I can really appreciate. Instead of capturing monsters by throwing a card at them with the Z button now functions as a Z boost, doubling your MP cost while making them more effective. Honestly, I never really bothered with this too much, because running out of mana with card costs versus how many crystals enemies drop to help replenish it didn't really play too nicely with this feature, especially since you'd usually want to use the more stronger stuff against bosses, and you're more likely to run out of MP and start cutting into your health pool, rather than taking them down faster than they can hurt you. Suicide by card overuse in general is a lot more likely than anything really harming you too much. And you don't want to be hurt too much in this game in general, which sounds like a really obvious statement until you realize that being low on health gives you a really bad running animation, cutting your speed in half as Terra limps forward. With the amount of ground you usually have to cover and how important range and positioning is in combat, low health is a terrible situation to be in. I have similar frustrations with how this game handles poison damage, where every time the damage ticks, you get a full stun animation from being hit for it. And this is in a game where there is no protection from incoming attacks while you're in your stun animation. Granted, you can abuse this on enemies too, but it feels really cheap at times when enemies are just stacking damage on you repeatedly with no real way out. At least immunity during cast animations is still as much of a thing as it was in the first game, though with the increased game speed and the controls being slightly less clunky than before, it's not as heavily required to be abused as it used to be. One feature that I kinda wish had more going for it is how they reworked summons, as they all have two abilities now, giving you their summoning animation as a timer to decide which of these two abilities you want to use. I really like this idea, but the summons in this game are so finicky that a lot of the time they just appear to miss their big AoE attack, despite enemies clearly being in what looks like the effective range. Their animations aren't too clear on what the exact hit range is either, so the lack of consistency in how they tend to work just made me not use them too much. Granted, I also cheesed the final boss with one, so your mileage might vary on this. In a similar sense, the new combo feature, where you Z-boost multiple cards that can combo together, was not something that I really found use for as much as I would have liked. Getting multiple cards together for use like that doesn't happen naturally, so you'd want to prepare them ahead of time. Getting multiple cards together for use like that doesn't happen naturally, so you'd want to prepare them ahead of time. But then using them all together immediately uses them up no matter how many uses they had left, so it's not something worth preparing for either. Using up 4 cards for a single attack when you can often do as much if not more damage with one summon card if it decides to hit is not all that useful, especially not when in a lot of the cases you'd be having these cards with you for the purpose of combos because of how damage is divided per element, rendering a good chunk of the cards in most combos useless individually. This one is a real shame, because the concept really reminds me of Battle Network's chip fusions, and I think that maybe with one more iterative title, they'd have been able to do this a lot better. It's a feature that I normally really like in games. Areas and cards have a really high focus on elements in this game, and I have mixed feelings about this. My biggest issue is how it handles affinity relating to this, where using cards of one type makes cards of the opposite type a lot more expensive to cast, while bringing up your immunities for status afflictions of the one that you're using. This can kind of lock you away from using certain cards due to them becoming entirely useless from a cost-value perspective. It's a small problem though, since you're probably not going to have too much issues with this in a regular playthrough, factoring in more with New Game Plus content and full completion. The positives here are that the areas you enter are usually focused on one element or another, which makes a lot of older cards more useful again instead of being phased out by an objectively better version of the same thing, as there is now more elemental variety. The card variety in general is a lot better than it was in the first game, with there being larger differences between possible status afflictions, ranges, damage, and MP cost per card over a larger pool of them. The biggest step forward is that the stages are no longer blocked off from revisiting during your regular playthrough, so you can't fall behind the power curve before reaching the end anymore, the way that you could in the first game. You cleared a stage and want to explore more there? You're allowed. In return, there's now a leveling system, where you get experience from killing enemies and get increased health and mana pools from leveling up, which is fine, but there were a few points where I did feel like I was pressured into grinding to clear a boss. Mostly one boss in particular. I just didn't have enough MP to cast the cards I needed to defeat him without killing myself, even with healing cards in my deck and just rushing towards the boss, ignoring all stage enemies and hazards before getting there with full mana, health, and card pool. The biggest benefit to being allowed to revisit stages immediately is the red fairy hunt. You can still collect these across each stage for a reward upon gathering enough of them, just like the first game. But there's a lot less pressure in being allowed to freely enter and exit stages at will. I know you could revisit stages after defeating the final boss in the original, but for regular content progression, not being at your best and knowing there's content gated away from you as you're slipping behind the power curve is not the best feeling. In general though, I'd still recommend doing stages once or twice before moving on, if only because there's a leveling system in place now and you need that experience for the higher MP pool you get each level. Besides this, I often found myself wanting for more cards by the time I got to a boss if I did explore, as my deck was starting to run empty. Though, with the lack of random encounters forcing fights on you, rushing to a boss when you know it's there doesn't feel all that bad compared to being locked into fights every few steps in the first game. There's also a new type of card that lets you transform into monsters to do various things, like jumping upwards to climb up ledges, flying over gaps, or crushing walls like Dogi. Because you're allowed to return to previous cleared areas, a lot of the older areas tend to have more to do in them once you start getting to these cards, which gives you more of a reason to explore the game world. I quite like this sort of stuff, so I was happy to see it. Besides all of this, card copying and transforming is back. The transformation paths feel a lot more loose in this game, with a lot of card pools now falling within small subcategories rather than a straight line of progression. So your blue lizard can now become a green lizard or a yellow lizard, all similar types of cards across different elements that also happen to function as a combo together. It did make me feel like the card pool was smaller than it actually was because so many of the transformation paths move in a circle, rather than constantly going up in power scaling the way that they did in the first game. While usually the card drops in the stages themselves are a lot better than what you'd get from the shop. Most of the stages themselves are pretty straightforward. There's a path that you need to follow to the end of the stage with some points where it splits off to collectibles. You get to the end and maybe fight a boss or a larger pool of smaller enemies and then clear the stage. There are some stages that break away from this, like one that makes you find a transform card inside of a cave before returning to the start of the stage and using it on the door. Or a shockingly decent stealth level that was pretty enjoyable. Because of the elemental theming, all the areas are pretty varied and colorful, with a larger pool of different monsters across them than anything in the first. It does come at the cost of theming and presentation, since nothing really feels as solid or grounded as it did in the first game, but Lost Kingdoms 2 does a much better job at breaking away from having just one stage formula than the first ever had. I did have some major beef with one stage though, and that was the Escort Mission. They're often bad enough in games, but in this game they just make you escort this guy who can fight. And he will fight. He will fight every monster he sees. He's very aggressive. The problem with this is that you're on a timer and have to clear the stage within a certain time. And you fail the stage if he dies. It's not the greatest, and it took me quite a few more tries than the other stages to clear it. Overall, while I do have problems with individual parts in Lost Kingdoms 2's structure, when they're all put together, they balance each other out really nicely. Exploring the stages is pretty fun, and a large part of the mechanics I didn't find all that useful are things that you don't really have to engage with to have a good time. I really like Lost Kingdoms 2, and I'd recommend it to anyone who enjoyed the first game and hasn't given this one a try yet. While the presentation and story isn't quite up there with the general mood of the original, the gameplay received enough of an improvement that I'm fine with it. Though it does remind me of Dark Souls more than the first did in some areas, I'm glad to have finally played it. Anyway, this was AboveUp and whoa!
Hey buddy, what are you doing?
I think I'm reviewing Final Fantasy X too, baby. This is awesome. Look at that, there's Yuna!
Yeah, I'm not thinking that's Yuna, dude. She's looking pretty different.
No, look, she's a summoner and she's got the boots, the shorts with the big belt over it, the top, the armband on one wrist, a flowing thing behind her that trails behind her run animation, and she's dual wielding in the artwork.
Yeah, I don't know, man. This looks like some kind of From Software kind of thing. I don't think this is Final Fantasy. This is like Final Dark Souls.
Oh, so should I review Final Fantasy X too then?
Hell no.
But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, this video was brought to you by people supporting me on Patreon. If you would like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen right now, head over to patreon.com/aboveup and I will, see ya.